Halito, and welcome to Native Chalk Talk, a podcast by natives for all. Here we're keeping our native ancestors' stories and history alive, while also sharing with you our native culture, traditions, and more. I'm Rachel Youngman, a Choctaw originally from Anadarko, Oklahoma. I hope you'll enjoy this journey with me as we learn from our Native American guests. And I hope you'll do me a favor. Feel free to like and share these episodes. I so appreciate it. Yakoki.
I am more than a maker.
I'm more than an outdoorsman.
More than a protector.
Than a graduate.
Than a princess.
An athlete.
A pastor.
I am more than a warrior.
Chata ilifinachili.
Chata ilifi nachili.
I am Choctaw proud.
I am Choctaw proud.
I am Choctaw proud.
We are the Choctaw Nation, and together we're more.
You're listening to part 2 of this series.
Jimmy, you sent me some excerpts from the Butterfield Overland Mail 100 years ago by Muriel H. Wright, which had some great information about the route. Why don't you read to us from Muriel's writings about what was recommended for passengers to carry with them while traveling?
It's got here, it says one Sharps rifle and 100 cartridges, a Colt's Navy revolver, and 2 pounds of balls, a knife and sheath, a pair of thick boots, and woolen pants, a half dozen pairs of thick woolen socks, 6 undershirts, 3 woolen overshirts, a wide awake hat, a cheap sack coat, a soldier's overcoat, 1 pair of blankets in summer and 2 in winter, a piece of India rubber cloth for blankets, a pair of gauntlets, a small bag of needles and pins, a sponge, hairbrush, comb, soap, etc., in an oil silk bag, 2 pairs of thick drawers, and 3 or 4 towels.
Oh my gosh. Now, I may be wrong, but doesn't it seem like that load would take up more than 40 pounds? That's a lot of stuff to have to pack.
Yeah, that's probably 2 or 3 times that amount, I would guess.
I particularly enjoyed reading Muriel's quotes from a Mr. Waterman L. Ormsby from the New York Herald, who traveled the Butterfield route to record his observations. Tell us what he said about his journey.
It says the moon shone brightly, but its light was obstructed by the trees, and the driver had to rely much on his knowledge for a guide. To see the heavy mail wagon whizzing and whirling over the jagged rock through such a labyrinth in comparative darkness, and feel oneself bouncing now on a hard seat, now against the roof, and then against the side of the wagon, surely no joke. I assure you, though I can truly say that I rather liked the excitement of the thing, but it was too dangerous to be continued without accident, and soon 2 heavy thumps and a bound of the wagon that unseated us all, and a crashing sound denoted that something had broken.
Oh my gosh, could you imagine riding along in the dark like that?
Surely not back then and not that long. I could just imagine the street is hard enough and it's in a car.
Yeah, there were all kinds of animals out there, people wanting to rob them. I mean, that was a problem back then too. Okay, so they discovered at the next station, which was Blackburn's, that they had a split wagon tongue and also a broken seat. Yikes. Now we get to the Choctaw man, William Holloway, your 4th great-grandfather, and the stage agent for Holloway Station, which was also where he lived. And do you know if he lived above the station or near it or what?
Everything that I've been told or seen, it just says it was on his land. So
Okay.
he probably either lived in the station itself or probably very close to it.
Okay. Well, and then what do you know about Mr. Holloway, who was technically your great-grandfather?
Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot that I could find in the archives or even online. From what it seems like, he just tapped on the shoulder to do this, and he decided he'd go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
It said he was charged with designing and managing the toll roads and the gates. And now I'm not sure what they consider toll roads or routes. It could just been, I'm sure it was nothing more than a dirt road. But he would take the ledger and record the people that came through, if they had mail or if they had passengers. But I think he did that by day, and then by night he was just an Indian cowboy and rancher and just hung out with his family.
Now, he was full-blood Choctaw, and he was born in 1803 in Tennessee. You had mentioned to me that he was one of the first 5 of the Choctaw to build and operate a stage house in 1858. So there is a monument for Holloway Station, and it was entered into the Oklahoma Historical Record in the 1970s. And you had sent me a copy of the National Register of Historic Places nomination form for Holloway Station that was created in the 70s. Holloway Station was 2 miles from the city of Red Oak, Oklahoma, in Latimer County. And I know we have some listeners from the Red Oak area, so shout out to y'all. Why don't you read to us from that historical record?
And the document states that most evidence of Holloway Station and the small settlement that surrounded it by now have disappeared. Holloway himself appears to have left the area when the Butterfield service was discontinued in 1861. Although a renewed toll gate authorization was granted one Jack McCurtain in 1866, he lived a mile or so southwest of the Holloway site. Only a few stones remain in the cemetery to the southeast of the present county road. The Holloway site is immediately across the road northwest of the cemetery. It goes on to say, it's an attractive spot, a small clearing on a timbered flat beneath the south bank of the Brazil Creek and the northern entrance to the Narrows. As recently as 1930, there remained a few scattered foundation stones and some evidence of a well to locate the site. If one looks closely, portions of the old Butterfield road grade as it climbs rather sharply out of the Narrows. I think what happened is, of course, they paused it during the Civil War. And when the Civil War reenacted, I believe he either just passed away or decided he didn't want to mess with it anymore. I really can't find anything where it says what happened to him after that. Everything says he never came back, or he never shows up in the books anymore. There's no telling. I mean, there could have been some foul play and somebody wanted the land. There's no telling, and I'm not speculating that. He was not a young man at that time as it was anyway back then, but
Yeah.
That's all I could find out is that he did it and then just kind of disappeared.
And you would know more about your own family than I would, but I also went and looked. I was looking through all kinds of went to newspapers.com, was trying to find him too. He was very elusive. And I mean, I guess if you could follow the land, what happened to the land at what point, and who did it get passed down to, if anyone, who bought it, that kind of thing, that would at least shed some light on it. But I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, I can't even find who his parents are. And there's nothing that I've been able to find on Ancestry or online. He just shows up one day and that's it. Now,
Right.
I might be able to get a hold of older people in the family that may know, but as of right now, I have no idea.
Well, since we have a vast group of listeners out there, some of them are ancestry nerds, much more than I am. If you know anything about William Holloway, you're welcome to share it with us. So the statement of significance talks about how the Butterfield Overland Mail Route's first Holloway Station stage arrived September 1858 on its way to San Francisco. It also mentions that Holloway Station was the least known of the 12 Butterfield stage lines through Indian Territory's 192-mile route. I did find, like, many years later in the 40s or 50s, some newspapers that would say Holloway Station that was in that area that was literally a place where you could get your car fixed. And I always wondered, did they take it from that same Holloway Station or not? Who knows? But anyway, it was cited as one of the more scenic stretches since it ran through the mountain passes between the Narrows, as early travelers used to call it. It also sounds like the stagecoaches used to have to travel some sharp ascents and descents, especially in areas like that. So the document also goes on to talk about the toll gates that were put in place. Some of the toll gates were logs laid across the road, supported by stone piers on either side of the road, and you could swing the so-called gate open after the toll was paid. So do you think someone was just like standing there by the toll gate all day waiting to take the money? How'd that work?
If I could guess, if it was the way I would do it, if I was, them, it being a family member of mine, they probably had something out there where they could sit under the shade and sit in a chair and whittle a stick and have something to drink and just wait.
Shell some peas, whatever.
Back, if not, it could have been one of his children he could have had out there. But something
Yeah.
tells me with one of his children out there, he was probably out there in a rocking chair drinking something and had some kind of whittle project going, if I was guessing.
I love it. Can you just imagine it? Oh, we need a time machine so we can go back and see all this stuff. Since this station was in Choctaw territory, the Choctaw Nation would have to grant the privilege of owning a toll gate to Choctaw citizens for a period of 6 years, and those who were not from the area had to pay the toll. Then the money would go to help pay for the road and assuming the liability for personal injury or damage to property against non-Choctaw citizens. The laws regarding the tolls regulated the scale of the toll fees and protection of the toll keeper. So tell us about the toll costs.
Sure. From what I saw, what I could find, it showed that a four-wheel wagon with four or more horses and a driver cost 50 cents. For wagons with only one or two horses, it was 25 cents. A man and a horse was only 10 cents, and each animal among a drive of animals like cattle, hogs, sheep, mules, etc., was another penny on top of that.
Okay. So honestly, some of that is more than I would have thought. Like the 50 cents, that was a lot of money back then. So
Yeah, I agree. I guess they wanted a premium.
I mentioned earlier that travelers would enjoy a break from the bumpy, dusty rides at stations along the trail, and taking time for a bite to eat was part of that recess. So let's say, Jimmy, you're on a trek to the west in one of the stagecoaches, and when you stop at Holloway Station, where are you going to eat? Well, in season 3, I had the pleasure of visiting with Chrissy Gray, a Choctaw descendant of the owner of the log cabin that was called the Edwards Store. Chrissy shared some wonderful insights into the history of this important location that was only 5 miles east of Holloway's, where folks in the community could purchase goods and the weary travelers like yourself, Jimmy, could stop to eat. Edwards was not only a place to get fed, but it was also considered the last place one could stop east of New Mexico to get supplies before heading into the longer portion of the journey. But let's back up a bit. The most significant treaty between the U.S. government and the Choctaw was to be negotiated and signed on September 27, 1830, at the Dancing Rabbit Creek Treaty Site in Noxubee County, Mississippi. These signatures meant the Choctaw would be surrendering 11 million Mississippi acres, the removal to Indian Territory imminent. The lives and futures of the Choctaw people would be changed forever. There once lived a Choctaw woman named Soki, who lived with her husband and 2 kids just up the hill from the treaty grounds. During the talks and signing of the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, U.S. Commissioners John Eaton and John Coffey stayed at Soki's homestead. She was a prominent member of the Choctaw tribe, and she served as a hostess during the treaty meetings. So, what did this have to do with Edward's store? Soki had a daughter named Nancy Hardaway, and these are Chrissy's ancestors. Nancy eventually lived in Indian Territory and married Thomas Edwards, who was non-native but was adopted into the Choctaw tribe through his marriage to Nancy, who was Choctaw. Together, they had 160 acres, and they made their home in the foothills of the Sandboys Mountains on the Fort Coffee Clear Boggy Bottom Road. Nancy and Thomas then established the Edwards store, which sat in front of their 2-room cabin. Thomas supplied the store with goods from Fort Smith, Arkansas. In the book, The Edwards Store, or Old Red Oak by I.C. Gunning, it's described that the Choctaws who had arrived in this area needed those trading posts, so they'd have tools for farming and building homes and other supplies for everyday living. Many folks saw the stores as a place to congregate, and, quote, the Edwards store thus became an important center of community activity and social life. Produce to sell, supplies to be purchased, mail to be sent and received, and stages coming through with strange people brought many natives to the store every day, where no doubt they exchanged local views and news. A storekeeper was in a position to become an important personage in such a community, and his word would come to carry much weight in local affairs, end quote. And of course, the store became a place for folks to also stop to eat along the Butterfield line, starting in 1858. Passengers traveling along the Butterfield Trail could eat a meal prepared by Nancy Hardaway Edwards herself and rest their horses at the Edwards store before moving on towards the next stage stop. This historic trading post, nestled among the beautiful Sandboys Mountains in Oklahoma, was absolutely essential for the Choctaw. But then came the Civil War. Thomas and Nancy were among the last loyalists to leave the Choctaw Nation and travel to Fort Smith to seek refuge. It's unknown if they stayed in Fort Smith, and for some time the Edwards store and cabin were abandoned. It's said that a local family took care of the old home place while the Edwards sought refuge. Eventually, Nancy Hardaway Edwards died in 1888, leaving the family homestead and business to her nephew Jesse Hardaway, where he relocated his family to the Edwards Hardaway homestead and opened a blacksmith shop at the store. He also became Justice of the Peace. In 1889, Jesse Hardaway built a 3-room addition onto the cabin, completing what we see today as the Edwards Hardaway cabin. By the way, when the railroad was built through the area, the town of Old Red Oak was moved to a different location about 7 miles away and was incorporated in 1900. The business at the Edwards store was then closed. In 1972, the Edwards store was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and a historical marker was placed at the family homestead. This cabin has been in Chrissy's family for over 170 years and is the only stop still standing in Oklahoma. So, yes, listeners, you can and are invited, in fact, to visit this only remaining building of these Butterfield Trail adventures, the Edwards store, and see this living piece of history for yourself. Chrissy, who has worked tirelessly to keep the property and cabin in good shape, would love to see you there. Visit edwardsstore.com for more information. Now, let's talk about another station along the route. Boggy Depot, which was in Choctaw Nation, was the largest and most important settlement on the mail route in Indian Territory. I've driven through that area many times, and now I want to stop in and pay more attention, perhaps learn a few things. My mom and dad also traveled there once to do some research on my Choctaw side of the family. I wish I knew what they had discovered, but it was many years ago, and they didn't keep a record of their findings. It was believed that some of my ancestors attended school there. Anyway, many Choctaws traveled across the Boggy Depot Road into Indian Territory during the relocation of the Trail of Tears. According to okhistory.org, Boggy Depot was situated between the Clear Boggy and Sandy Creeks, 14 miles southwest of present Atoka in Atoka County. Founded by Chickasaw Indians in 1837, it stood along the Texas Road in a trail that led from Fort Smith, Arkansas to Fort Washita, and was a station on the Butterfield Overland Mail Route. Boggy Depot's post office opened in 1849, and the local newspaper was the Choctaw and Chickasaw Observer. Boggy Depot was the location of the first Chickasaw agency in the West and served sometimes as the capital of the Choctaw Nation from 1858 to 1860. During the Civil War, it housed the principal Confederate supply depot in Indian Territory. After the war, a flour mill and a cotton gin operated northeast of town, and a salt works was established along nearby Salt Creek. The Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railway bypassed Boggy Depot in 1872, prompting businessmen and residents to relocate to Atoka. Others moved 2 miles south and founded New Boggy Depot, present Boggy Depot. Nothing remains of Old Boggy Depot except its cemetery, where Choctaw Chief Allen Wright and Reverend Cyrus Kingsbury are buried. The town site presently located in Boggy Depot State Park is listed in the National Register of Historic Places. The final stop I'd like to talk about was Culbert's Ferry, which crossed the Red River and happened to also be the final stop on the Butterfield Trail. The route from Fort Smith to Culbert's Ferry was actually notable in Indian Territory. According to Muriel Wright's writings, it was, and I quote, in use until shortly before Oklahoma became a state in 1907. It had its beginnings along an old Indian trail southwest of Fort Smith when that post was established near the mouth of Poteau River on the Arkansas in 1817. The part from Fort Smith Boggy Depot was marked and worked in places in 1837 for the immigrating Chickasaws during their removal to the Indian Territory when on their way to the new agency and a trader's store at the depot on the Boggy. Miss Wright also talks about the experience of the travelers who stopped at Boggy Depot. While giving the horses a brief rest, a good dinner, including rare dishes of sugar, butter, and pastry, was served to the travelers at the home of Mr. Colbert. He was of the well-known Chickasaw family of Colberts and had owned and operated the ferry at this place on Red River for 5 years. He is described as a young man of about 30, very jovial and friendly. Mr. Colbert evinces some enterprise in carrying the stages of the company across the ferry free of charge in consideration of the increased travel which it will bring his way. He also stipulates to keep the neighboring roads in excellent order and has already done much towards it. He has a large gang of slaves at work on the banks of the river, cutting away the sand so as to make the ascent easy. His boat is simply a sort of raft pushed across the shallow stream by the aid of poles in the hands of sturdy slaves. The fare for a 4-horse team is $1.25, and the net revenue of the ferry about $1,000 per annum. Along the way, we've talked about the Civil War erupting in 1861, which caused a disruption in the Butterfield route, and Culbert's Ferry was no exception, as it ceased operations during the war. However, Confederate troops would still utilize the ferry, and after the war, cattle drives from Texas also crossed on Culbert's Ferry. This also meant the town of Colbert grew around the area. Now, a railway bridge was built across the Red River in 1872, which meant traffic was replaced by the railroad and was rerouted another direction, causing a reduction in the Colbert's Ferry traffic. So, Mr. Frank Colbert just built his own toll bridge in 1874, which replaced the original ferry crossing. However, a flood washed away both bridges, so he went back to operating his ferry. Smart man. The Red River Bridge Company then bought the bridge charter from Colbert and eventually saw the drama between Oklahoma and Texas in the Red River Bridge War. And that's a whole other story. The only thing you need to know, listeners, is that Oklahoma won.
My family tells me that all the time.
You're in Texas. Do you have family in Oklahoma?
I think at one point, almost all of Oklahoma was related to me at one time. Yes, I've
Who
got
knows? We
family.
may be related.
That's what my wife said. You're related to everybody. Are you sure we're not cousins? So I had to check, make sure. But yeah, I've
Well,
got.
I mean, with your grandma having that many kids, yeah, that would make sense. So going back to your family's stagecoach station, Holloway Station, just as we talked about before, the Civil War disrupted this good thing going on of the Butterfield Overland Trails. Mail had run the route twice weekly from St. Louis to San Francisco until June 30th, 1861, a couple of months after the outbreak of the Civil War. Believe it or not, only 3 years after it began, the service ceased, replaced by more direct routes that ran up north, telegraph lines, and the railroad. So, Jimmy, can you believe that? Like all of these trails and stations created, the formality of it all, the legalities, it all only lasted 3 years.
Yeah, and it was a race against the clock because from what I could find out, the agreement was it was until the telegraph could be completed.
Okay.
So war came across, the stagecoach line and the routes were still there, but it was commandeered by the Confederates, and they actually used all of their wagons and supplies for military purposes. And then when it came back, the era of the ways of the war, they were able to expedite completing the telegraph. The only thing I wish I knew if the Pony Express actually touched that stage house when my grandfather was there. But I think when it came through, I think by the time he was added to the contract, I think he was already gone at that point. But it was shortly after the Civil War. So I think they just let it go to the wayside after that.
So Holloway Station just, it just went to the wayside, huh?
Yeah, it was taken over or just decided it was obsolete, and they made their own station a little ways down the road and went from there. I know my grandmother and mother, they've actually been up there to see up in Latimer County where it was and see the monument.
Oh, wow.
A few years ago, they went up there for the powwow, and they swung through there and checked that out while they were up there. And she said it's just, an open field with trees and mountains in the background.
Isn't that crazy? It was all erased, and there were all these stagecoaches coming through there at that time, and just, people living there, of course. Well, when the Civil War ended, we don't see anything of William Holloway anymore, as you had mentioned earlier. He passed away in 1860. Holloway Station was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1972. So you mentioned that there's still a monument still standing there where Holloway's once stood.
Yeah, it looks like it's just a plaque in the ground, but it looks like it probably is about 2 feet by 3 feet. It's not like the historical markers you see on the highways that are up on the poles. It's
Yeah,
just a plaque there in the ground where it states what it was and when it was in operation.
fascinating. Well, and there isn't much left of anything pertaining to these stations, except for thankfully the Edwards store. I look back at Muriel Wright's words when she described Mr. John Butterfield, who traveled the first full route that set out from Fort Smith through Indian Territory, successfully arriving to St. Louis on October 10th to much rejoicing. She stated, he was elated with the success and telegraphed the President of the United States, the Overland mail arrived today at St. Louis from San Francisco in 23 days and 4 hours. The stage brought through 6 passengers. President Buchanan sent a reply, I cordially congratulate you upon the result. It is a glorious triumph for civilizations and the Union. Settlements will soon follow the course of the road, and the East and West will be bound together by a chain of living Americans which can never be broken. I wonder if they could have predicted that after all their hard work and success, the Civil War would alter their course of their vision. I also wonder if our Native ancestors could have imagined that the trails they once used to feed their families and survive the harsh seasons would be seized by intruders, transforming these paths into connectors for the non native world and its notion of progress. One could also argue that this confiscation of the ancestral trails also brought both natives and non natives to their loved ones and to see another side of this beautiful land that they may never have seen before. And perhaps this also enabled them to build their own commerce to provide goods for others. I, for one, am intrigued and hope to visit each of these places, even though most of what remains is stones and monuments. Jimmy, before we go, I know you'd love to give a shout out to your family. Tell us about them.
Sure, thank you. Kayla, she's an amazing artist. I actually have so far just one tattoo that she actually drew when she was 11, and it's pretty good. But she won a All-State Artist Award from the governor of Texas when she was in 6th grade.
And this
She
is
was
your oldest daughter, Kayla?
yes, she'll be 22 in September. But yeah, and she was one of two 6th graders that were nominated in the whole state of Texas. And she didn't even know that she was nominated for this award when it happened. So it was kind of a shock. But
Wow.
they actually had her artwork on display in the museum. And at the time, the governor's wife was presenting the awards. And then her artwork actually was on tour in several other museums for about a year and a half before it came back to us. Um, Hera, my second child, she'll be 18 this year, also in September. She just graduated high school with honors. She was in STEM, avid. She's very big on volunteering in the community, and she's so dedicated to her church. She just, for her graduation present, she asked for a guitar so she could play in the church band. So she's been learning guitar, and then she's been
That.
doing that. And then my youngest, Ray, she also is pretty smart. She just graduated 8th grade, and she is also in STEM. Her and Tara are both in the National Honor Society, Junior Society, and then the one in high school there. But she won an award, and I believe there's only 10 kids in her school, but she averaged 97 or higher for the first 5, 6 weeks of the year on all her core classes,
Wow.
which was very, I think, very impressive, especially in today's education system with so many things changing and, some of the quarantine, the remote stuff, just
Mm-hmm.
it's
For sure.
unbelievable they were able to stay dedicated and to do that. Very proud.
I can tell. Proud papa. And obviously, again, you said you have this whole household of girls, and you've raised some very intelligent women who are going to go off and do really good things. So shout out to the Stevens family. Jimmy, I really enjoyed learning about your ancestors and their good work in Indian Territory. Before we go, are there any words of wisdom you'd like to share with our listeners?
One other thing, I do have to give their mother credit.
Mm.
Even though we're not married, she's a very important part of their life and
Aw.
very integral in the relationship that we all have together. Only words of wisdom I would give is, and I've learned this the hard way, that if you're a parent, don't ever make your kids wait. If they need something or they want your attention or their time, give it to them, because one day they might not ask for it. The time is the most important thing you can give someone, because you'll never give it back. I want to thank you so much for allowing me to do this. It might be, insignificant or small to some people, but it means a lot to me, just to be a part of the history, and not to mention just the mail, but everything that came after, what they're able to do based on those routes. I never would have thought, a year ago when on that Facebook page where I said, hey, if you ever do a show on this, let me know. My family has something to do with it. I never imagined in a million years imagined that it would lead to this. So humbled. I'm so thankful, and just keep doing what you're doing. It's amazing. And I thank you so much.
You just made my day. Thank you so much for saying that. And honestly, the reason I was interested was what you had to say was so cool. And it was an area that I had not delved into before. And I've really appreciated not only your words, but also for sharing about your family. And in addition, for this season, for season 7, our listeners will actually get to hear some of the information that has come from you about some of the items I'll be covering, like Tamaha and other places that will be in some of the episodes that you've been kind enough to go do some research on for me. Time is something I don't have much of, and you are a huge history lover and know a lot about history. And so I want to also thank you for helping me out. It's a huge help, more than you even could know. So thank you. Well, today one can still see the faint remains of the wagon ruts along some of the Butterfield trails across the United States. I am overcome by the historical significance of these paths from both ancient times to today. These trails, once a vital artery for communication and transport, wound through rugged landscapes and whispering tales of a bygone era. The sheer determination and resilience of those who traveled it come alive in my imagination, from the intrepid stagecoach drivers to the hopeful settlers seeking new beginnings. I can almost hear the echoes of wheels on rocky ground and the distant calls of travelers. The Butterfield Trail is more than just a physical route through Indian Territory. It is a testament to human endeavor and determination, a link between past and present that leaves me in awe of its enduring legacy. Yakuki.
Thanks for listening to Native Chalk Talk. Be sure to join our community on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and check us out at nativechalktalk.com. Stay tuned for the next episode. You're going to love it. Yakuki. Thank you, my friends.